When people say, Hasan, why are you anti-NATO? When people say, Hasan, why are you anti-NATO as a Turkish person? I suspect that the many different mentions of how all matter of revolutionary and socialist movements in Turkey were absolutely gutted and eviscerated by the government and the Turkish Milli İstihbarat Teşkilatı, and how it was propped up, created, designed by the Americans, by the CIA, and how how NATO propped up the mafia, the Turkish mafia, alongside the creation of the Turkish ultranationalist movement, the Grey Wolves, and how they destroyed any matter of Turkish socialism in Turkey in an identical fashion to Gladio in Italy, as a matter of fact. Let's watch.
On an early November evening in 1996, a black Mercedes, traveling at nearly 110 miles per hour, crashed into a truck near Susurluk in western Turkey. 3 of the 4 passengers in the car died instantly. When a few local journalists arrived at the scene, they had expected to find a irregular car accident. But what they discovered would shock Turkey to the core.
Kanal D.
İyi akşamlar sayın seyirciler. Türkiye'yi sarsan Susurluk kazası.
Among the accident victims, notorious contract killer for a CIA-assisted secret organization, Abdullah Çatlı, who was also a leader of the fascist Grey Wolves and an underworld drug lord wanted by Interpol, and his girlfriend, former beauty queen Gonca Uz. So far so good, nothing to be shocked about. But who else was in this car? The third victim, Istanbul Deputy Police Chief Hüseyin Kocada. The fourth person, the seriously injured Sedat Bucak, was a conservative member of parliament who was also a big landowner and the leader of several state-supported village guard units engaged in the war against Kurdish liberation fighters. Now, this is not good. Why the hell were a police chief, a politician, and a fascist criminal in the same car? It's not as if these people just happened to share an Uber pool or something. No serious arrests were made after the incident, and the concrete ties between the passengers remain shrouded in mystery to this day. In what came to be known as the Susurluk scandal, parliamentary investigations scratched the surface of a vast shadow network involved in one of the bloodiest and most mysterious periods in the modern history of Turkey. An interconnected web of Turkish police, military, secret service, politicians, criminal bosses, fascist paramilitaries, and the CIA, united by a common goal: eliminate communism. Turkey, officially the Republic of Türkiye, is situated on the Anatolian Peninsula in Western Asia, spanning across 2 continents, giving it an important geopolitical position and making it a regional power of significance. As an early member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, the Turkish armed forces constitute the 2nd largest standing military force in NATO. Turkey also hosts the Incirlik Air Base, operated and controlled by the US Air Force, which served as a main hub for operations during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Ankara, Turkey's 2nd largest city, serves as the nation's capital, while Istanbul, its largest city, acts as the primary financial hub. Turkey currently ranks as the world's 20th largest economy in terms of nominal GDP. This February, more than 50,000 people lost their lives following the terrifying earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, and the disastrous effects and the response are dramatically worsened by the profit-based system and the according corruption of the government. Kurdish regions are hit especially hard, and there's a history behind this. Turkey was already in a horrible situation this year, with inflation soaring and its currency collapsing. On top of it, the country is headed toward the general election on May 14, in which the current president is expected to use all available means to stay in power. His opponent, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, leader of the Republican People's Party, or short CHP, formed an alliance appealing to voters from the liberal left to the conservative right, We'll look at the important history of that party soon. Since 2002, Turkey's political system has been under the rule of the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, and its leader Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Under Erdoğan, the country has faced recession and stagnation in the last decade, accompanied by high inflation in this year, and went through a shift from a parliamentary republic to an executive presidential system, eroding the so-called separation of powers in bourgeois democracy. Traditionally, the prime minister position has been more important, but since the 2017 referendum, the prime minister position has been abolished, and now the president has much greater executive power.
Videoyu yükleyen Türk mü yoksa değil mi? Galiba Almancı. Bilmiyorum. Bu kadar fazla bilmez çünkü normalde. Bu Almanya'da da Almancı olma ihtimali var yani. Çünkü yoksa nereden bilir bu kadar bilmiyorum yani Türk yani Türkiye'nin tarihini.
In order to more fully grasp Turkish politics.
Abi yok, ben bu elemandan özellikle istedim araştırıp yapmasını. Ha öyle mi? Ben zannediyorum ki belki hani Kürt Almancı olabilir.
Turkey's role within imperialism today and the roots of the fascistic character of its political system. We need to turn the clock back by exactly 100 years. After the Ottoman Empire broke apart 1 century ago, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed in 1923 after the so-called War of Independence by the country's first president, Ebedi Şef, Eternal Chief, Mustafa Kemal, honored with the name Atatürk, Father of the Turks, and the founder of the oldest political party of Turkey, the aforementioned Republican People's Party, or CHP. But Turkey didn't actually gain real independence. It was still a semi-colonial country. What does that mean? Before the War of Independence, the Ottoman Empire had been declining as it was ridden with crises and got outcompeted by the Western European imperialist powers. It was considered the sick man of Europe. As it slowly dissolved, it was economically dependent on Germany and was pressured to fight on its side during World War I.
You like Atatürk? I feel about Atatürk as I feel about America's founders as well. You know, there's some good there, and then there's a lot of bad there as well. Ultimately, it's not identical to a bourgeois revolution against the monarchy, but, you know.
After the loss of the Central Powers, it got pillaged by French and British capital. The European imperialists were about to seize much of trade and industry, and the Turkish ruling class faced a life-or-death struggle. The emerging bourgeoisie, or capitalist class, united with the feudal gentry and the landlords, managed to take leadership.
Yeah, he's definitely better in the sense that he didn't own slaves. So there's that, but to be fair, it is much, much later as well.
In the independence struggle and consolidated the republic under a one-party state, formally abolishing the Sultanate and liberating the occupied territories. But the Turkish economy remained dependent, i.e., it provided cheap raw materials and workforce to the imperialists and opened a market for their industrial products. Large banks, transport routes, as well as parts of industry were still in the hands of foreign companies. This dependency would lead Turkey into a huge trade deficit in the 40s, further seeking foreign loans, subjugating the country and holding back independent industrial development. But not everyone lost due to this dependency. The Turkish capitalist class made a massive fortune through this collaboration in exploiting the toiling masses in Turkey, seizing properties of Anatolian Greeks and Armenians, and pandered to the imperialist fear of rising communism after the October Revolution in Russia in 1917. And anti-communism would unite them throughout the century, both ideologically and in terms of concrete organization. This analysis was key for one of the, if not the most notable Turkish communist, İbrahim Kaypakaya, who would later criticize the Turkish left, which proposed such things as emphasizing an alliance with the Kemalist movement, painting them as an independent progressive revolutionary force. However, Kaypakaya wrote, quote, "The Kemalists, even during the years of the Liberation War, were embarking on collaboration with the imperialists. They did not neglect to carry out covert collaboration with them against the Socialist Soviet Union externally and against communists, working class, and other toiling people internally. On the other hand, while raining down the most extreme compliments in order to obtain aid, on the other were seeking a basis for secret agreements to be made with the US, Britain, and France. The Kemalist dictatorship is a military fascist dictatorship over the workers, peasants, urban petty bourgeoisie, low-ranking public servants, and Democrat intellectuals." Toward the end of the 19th century, Marxist ideas had begun to penetrate Turkish society, and various Turkish communist groups had begun.
Not to get you into trouble with Turkish chatters, but do you think Kemal Pasha was a MI6 plant similar to Reza Pahlavi? No, I don't think so.
To emerge, not just in Turkey. Some emigre workers in Germany, referred to as the Turkish Spartakists, had joined up with.
I think he was a Yoruba, and some of that, like some of the revolutions that came about as a consequence of his like Yoruba attitude were actually good. Like things that I also personally believe were very socially progressive and like a legitimately good thing. Yeah, he was a Franco-boo, big French Revolution head for sure. That's why laïcité was implemented as well.
Rosa Luxemburg and the other Spartakists in Germany, and sought to bring the lessons of the November Revolution back home. These groups would then merge into the Communist Party of Turkey, or short TKP, in Baku. Only 1 year after the TKP was founded in 1920, its founder, Mustafa Sufi, and the entire 14-member leadership were brutally assassinated, most likely on the order of Mustafa Kemal, after being lured on a boat at the Black Sea. Sufi's Russian wife, Maria, was taken hostage, abused, and used as a sex slave by the murderers. In 1923, the state closed down the Istanbul Workers' Association, arrested its leaders, and formed its own bourgeois unions to draw people away from workers' organizations. Already in 1920,
kind of like AFL-CIA.
Mustafa Kemal had set up a fake puppet communist party to counter the growing influence of the actual communists. The actual Communist Party was then banned in 1925 and had to operate underground throughout the 20th century. In 1927, railway workers organized a massive strike lasting for 2 weeks against a French company operating in Turkey. Hundreds of workers and their family members laid down on the tracks, and the Kemalist government dispatched a military unit which opened fire on the unarmed workers and their families, covering the rails in blood. With the extensive adoption of the Codice Rocco, the fascist penal code enacted under Mussolini in Italy, paragraphs 141 and 142 found their way into Turkish law, prohibiting any organization of class-based associations and imposing the death penalty on anyone leading them. The Atatürk reforms made Turkey into a secular modern state, but Mustafa Kemal also wanted to create a homogeneous Turkey. What was meant by this, the minority ethnic groups had to experience brutally. The Kurds, living predominantly in the southeast or in northern Kurdistan, make up around 20 to 25% of Turkey's population. Atatürk, called them Mountain Turks, banned the Kurdish language in schools, prohibiting speaking Kurdish in public spaces, Kurdish newspapers, and Kurdish parties. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds were forcibly deported out of Turkey to Turkify the region. After Kurds rebelled against the repression, the state initiated a pogrom in the Kurdish majority region of Diyarbakir, burning down villages and killing over 15,000 people. Later in the 30s, the Turkish armed forces were sent to crush a Zaza Kurdish rebellion in the notorious Dersim genocide, in which tens of thousands of people were massacred. Atatürk's Turkification was in line with the previous regime of the Young Turks, which committed the Armenian genocide, murdering over 1.5 million Armenians, with only a fraction of the Armenian population surviving. The Turkish government denies the genocide to this day. From 1935, German imperialism would regain its influence over Turkey. Germany helped train Turkish soldiers and was Turkey's primary source for armaments, and the Nazis would find great admiration among their quickly growing Turkish counterparts. Ultranationalists in Turkey had excellent relations with Nazi Germany, and its most notorious representative, Colonel Alparslan Türkeş, was the contact person of the Nazis in Turkey. He would frequently quote Hitler's Mein Kampf in his speeches, and his so-called pan-Turkist movement's support for Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini was strong. Ruzi Nazar, another prominent pan-Turkist, joined the Nazis on the Eastern Front to fight for the creation of a Turkestan. Nazar was later recruited by the Americans and became the CIA's station chief in Turkey. More on that later. The pseudoscientific pan-Turkism movement, with its doctrine of racial superiority, sees as its goal the political and cultural unification of all Turkic peoples. Since many ethnic Turks lived in the Soviet Union, the movement naturally linked its reactionary ideology to the destruction of the Soviet Union and communism. It was not until 1945, when Turkey declared war on Germany.
How does Turkey deny the Armenian genocide? They say that it is, one, they say it is a lie, and two, it's taught in schools as like a forced immigration of Armenians into Syria, specifically like a Trail of Tears type situation, exactly, where like in the most reductive terms, it basically is Armenians collaborated in the villages in the eastern part of Turkey with the Russians because they were Orthodox Christians, just like the Russians were during World War I, and they engaged in pogroms against Turkish Muslim populations and like Turkish populations. And so the Turkish military came in and forcibly removed them from their homes and forced them to basically march to Syria and many other places. And then some people died alongside in that process. Like that's the way that it is described. Well, but it is a deliberate, systematic, targeted ethnic cleansing campaign, of course.
When it was pretty much clear that they were losing. Nazi Germany was defeated, but fascism was not. In collaboration with the
the official Turkish government position on obviously World War II was neutrality, like, or not even neutrality, but just not collaborating with the Germans. In World War I, if you guys remember, talked about this before, World War I, Turkey was aligned with Germany. World War I is obviously very different than World War II in general. World War I in and of itself is just a world war amongst superpowers, all colonial superpowers, central powers fighting against one another, and utilizing that as a way to, pick apart other colonies. That's how England took over, British Palestinian Mandate from the Ottoman Empire, for example. And yeah, it was imperialist colonialist competition. Yes, exactly. And Turkey, in its developmentary stages, was like, we are not participating. We are not participating in World War II at all. When Germany wanted to reinstate the alliance that Turkey or the Ottoman Empire previously had.
Imperialist master, the United States. The pan-Turkist leaders would play a key role in the brutal unleashing of fascist violence against the left in Turkey. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, the US was by far the dominant capitalist imperialist power in the world. But there was no time to rest for the Yankees. There was still a more potent enemy out there, growing in popularity, not least due to the Soviet Union's central role in the defeat of Hitler. US President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, a plan to contain the Soviet Union and rising communist organization, particularly in Greece and Turkey, by asking Congress for $400 million in military and economic assistance, specifically for Greece and Turkey. In his address to Congress,
The Dagestan massacre was posed at a progressive cause and people believed it. Dagestan is not just about being Kurdish, though. State was also trying to outlaw old feudal systems and serfdom. Fascists took advantage of this very well.
In 1947, Truman stressed, quote, "Should we fail Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the west as well as to the east. We must take immediate and resolute action." The request was approved in 1948, the same year.
That video blames every other country but not Turkey. Wait, what? Dude, if you think this video is not completely fucking anti everything Turkey related and how you're lost in the sauce, I think.
When Turkey joined the Marshall Plan and was admitted into the IMF. The United States was now the chief imperialist partner of the Turkish state, but it was more than just a partner. Meanwhile, in 1948, in northern Turkey, a certain someone, whom the Turkish state would consider as the most dangerous revolutionary and a serious threat to the government, saw the light of day. Born into a poor peasant Alevi family, Ibrahim Kaypakaya would later become the foremost manifestation of the revolutionary communist line of the Turkish proletariat. A symbol of camaraderie and the armed struggle, he would live a short life, but an important one. At the time of his birth, the Turkish government underwent certain changes to adapt to the new imperial.
Dagestan still is a relatively big stronghold for socialism. Dagestan supports current CHP, CHP, TKP, Turkish Communist Party, and DEM, the Kurdish majority party. Dagestan is a stronghold for the socialists. If you recall, I mean, way back in the day when they directly elected a dirty commie in Dersim as well.
Realist world order. Within the Turkish ruling class, a variety of cliques with competing interests formed their separate parties. The newly created center-right Democrat Party, or short, DP, was one of them, founded by former members of the CHP, most prominently by the soon infamous Prime Minister Adnan Menderes. The shift from a one-party government to a multi-party state wasn't out of an idealist concern for democracy. The then-president İsmet İnönü, known as the right-hand man of Mustafa Kemal, knew very well that if opposition parties weren't included, Turkey would fall to social rebellion. Calls for freedom of speech and so on were of course justified, but primarily it was because, quote, the comprador big bourgeoisie and landlords clique in opposition wanted the same thing for themselves. On the other hand, the international situation is forcing the bourgeoisie and landlord class to adopt parliament, since an open terrorist dictatorship that abolishes parliament will expose its fascist visage both to the popular masses domestically and world public opinion and be isolated. This is the function of parliament in Turkey, to mask fascism. The government had introduced a trade union law which was supposed to fulfill the, quote, necessity of Western democracy.
Like something to remember, because it's Turkey and where there's a predominantly Western audience watching this, is like what he's describing there is a socialist framework on the Turkish parliament, and therefore it is no different than like the American bourgeois democracy. Okay? Something to remind people is that fundamentally, it is a democracy identical to the American democracy or democracy that you see in European countries. It is, however, a bourgeois democracy, and therefore, that is a socialist critique of bourgeois democracy, and not necessarily saying it's fake.
Legalizing the formation of trade unions, but maintaining the ban on strikes. Unions also had to be apolitical and, quote, nationally oriented instead of internationalist. In order to control the emerging labor movement, the Turkish Ministry of Labor, with the help of US advisors, such as the anti-communist organizer and later leader of the US Trade Union Federation, AFL-CIO, Irving Brown, established the Turkish, the Confederation of Turkish Workers Union. Its leader declared to struggle, quote, against the abominable communism. The state-affiliated trade union would receive lots of funding from the Agency for International Development, a US body that works closely with the CIA. In its program some years later, the union declared that it, quote, pursues a policy that has the aim of eliminating the causes of the deepening of class differences and class conflicts, and aims to establish balance, peace, and cooperation between the classes. After World War I, Irving Brown, along with CPUSA member turned CIA help.
What is bourgeois democracy? Is it a bad thing if we have it? Bourgeois democracy, is it a bad thing if we have it? I mean, if you're a worker, it's not great for you. If you're a liberal, you think it's great. It's the peak of democracy. I don't know. Do you think our current two-party system that seemingly always aligns on certain boundaries that pertain to improving material conditions for all Americans unconditionally is a good thing, then yeah, you'll see it as a good thing. You'll see it as a positive. It always has the capacity to erode civil liberties and also greatly worsen material conditions for the working class, as we cover on a daily basis. So I would say that there is probably a better evolution beyond that. Liberal democracy, bourgeois democracy is significantly better than monarchies, of course. But I personally believe that it's time for a evolution.
Helper J. Lovestone, became known as splitters of unions who organized against communist influence in the labor movement. Brown gave money to anti-communist currents which broke strikes in Italy or France, for instance. It's really amazing how far Western powers went and still go to pacify workers and hinder them from developing revolutionary consciousness. The Menderes clique was more sympathetic toward the US, and it had a more positive stance toward conservative religious groups than the CHP, thus gaining support from sections frustrated with Kemalist secularization. With the rising influence of the US, the DP further bolstered its potential for electoral victory because it coincided with the American wishes to privatize state enterprises and a general westernization of Turkey. After the DP's rise to power, Turkey sent troops to the Korean War in 1950 to ensure membership in NATO, which had formed in 1949. Anti-communist persecution intensified and coincided with McCarthyism in the US. The state targeted not just organized Marxists, but university professors and various progressive intellectuals and journalists. American experts poured in to advise Turkey in westernizing education, teaching children the merits of self-responsibility, the evils of collectivism, reintroducing religious courses, and connect them to anti-progressive propagandizing, showing anti-communist educational movies, and so on.
I don't know if he mentions this, but Adnan Menderes, by the way, is obviously very right-wing, religious, conservative, populist, and is like his movement of religious conservative populism is basically what ultimately gave way to Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which comes from that same background and same clique, and also Fethullah Gülen. Now, Fethullah Gülen and Recep Tayyip Erdogan are two sides of the same coin. However, one is directly aligned with the CIA, and the other one happens to be the president now, previously prime minister, now president of Turkey. They're all, yeah, it shatters that hepsi tarikatçı. So tarikat is like the fundies of Turkey, if that makes sense. And Fethullah Gülen operates a cult, a religious Muslim cult, very fundamentalist, and happens to do so from the comfort of his home in the Poconos. Adnan Menderes'e laf ediyorsun ama bilmiyorsun. Yapma abi, yapma. %100 top of the hour ad break çakacaksın şimdi, değil mi? Amına koyayım senin kodlama 0. He's trying to fucking serve me a 3-minute ad break debate in Turkish. Yakalarım. Abi burada Ohio'da FETÖ okulu varmış yaşadığım yerde. Siyah Amerikalı adam Türkçe biliyor. Karşıma çıktı amına koyayım. Evet. Her yerde var ki. Amerika'da her yerde var. Afrika'da her yerde var. Amerikan parasıyla açıyorlar. CIA. Anyway. Yeah, at the top of the hour, there is a 3-minute ad break. Oğlum Adnan Öven adamın bu chatte ne işi var? Sikeceğim. Hayır. Taşak geçiyor. Debate atmaya çalışıyor Ondan sonra dönüp diyecek ki 3 dakikalık advertisement break geliyor. Dedi zaten. Debate oğlu. Anyway. Dedim bile görmedin ha. Bak. Her saat başı 3 dakikalık reklam olacaktır demiş Adnan Menderes. Senin amına koyayım. Kayboldu diyorlar FETÖ burada. Orada haber olmadı değil mi? Yok, ne haber olacak burada? Americans don't know who the fuck Fethullah Gülen is. They don't care. They don't know. It's just like he's just some random dude. There are so many Fethullah Gülen types in the United States of America that like most Americans have no fucking clue. There's a Fethullah Gülen for every country that America is involved in. Like some fucking rabid, fundamentalist, right-wing weirdo that the CIA keeps on payroll and protects. For every country that America has an involvement in. Yeah, Enes Freedom. Enes Kanter Freedom is one of his main guys. The forward-facing side of Fethullah Gülen's influence. But I'm unfamiliar with the... Wait, what? Kara Swisher AOC podcast mentioned me? Kara Swisher did a podcast with AOC and she mentioned me? Oh, let's go.
Dissemination of in some form.
We'll look at that in a sec. We'll look at that later. at 58:18. Okay. Anyway, let's continue. But something to consider. The reason why I brought up Menderes, I don't know how deep he will go into Adnan Menderes, but like his influence and his religious movement, religious conservative populist movement was so significant in Turkish politics now that like the leading coalition and more importantly, Recep Tayyip Erdogan himself personally and the fucking CIA asset living in the goddamn Poconos is all a part of his like cultish movement.
The Pentagon was also aware that fostering and utilizing reactionary Turkish nationalism would serve their strategic interests, as it was a potent deterrent against communist ideas. The Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, was the covert action arm of the CIA and unambiguously called in its charter for, quote, propaganda, economic warfare, preventative direct action, including sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition and evacuation measures, subversion against hostile states, and support of indigenous anti-communist elements. Indigenous anti-communist elements is, of course, a much nicer expression than fascists. By the end of 1951, Turkey had received over $400 million in military aid along with 1,200 US military advisors. Within the next 3 decades, Turkey would receive a further $5.8 billion in military support, including training programs and arms supply. Those aid packages, as usual, had hundreds of strings attached, such as Turkey allowing the Americans to restructure its military and secret service apparatus, or the commitment to buy US products. One example of that is the US forcing Turkey to focus on building automobile highways and airports, as opposed to railroads, through obliging them to focus on importing automobiles and petroleum, which are of course a much bigger opportunity to make a profit. Then, naturally in 1952, Turkey officially became a member of NATO. The country was key for the Western powers, guarding a third of NATO's total borders with the communist bloc and serving as an important balcony for US operations in the Middle East. And then, as left organization, demonstrations...
This is the part that is like the most important as far as like my anger and resentment for NATO. As a Turkish person, this is where you will now develop a better understanding of what NATO does in other countries.
And the opposition to US imperialism intensified. In the shadows of the NATO membership announcement, a secret, bloody fascist network had already begun to spread its tentacles. As a result of Turkey becoming an appendage of US imperialism, and due to the rapidly rising popularity of communist and progressive ideas, it naturally became involved with the notorious Operation Gladio, a secret army intelligence complex organized by NATO and the CIA in collaboration with intelligence agencies throughout Europe to counter the communist threat. Gladio was so powerful and vast, and yet the intelligence agencies managed to largely keep it a secret for decades. It was not until the 90s when it was officially revealed by Italian politician Giulio Andreotti. The revelation was a bombshell and made waves around the world. The operation was particularly brutal in Italy, Greece, and Turkey. In each of these countries, violent fascist or neo-Nazi groups were used to crush the left, such as in Italy, where progressive movements were infiltrated and where fascist terrorist attacks were blamed on the left wing to discredit it, all with the help of state security. I've made a video on Gladio in Italy, which you should check out after watching this. But it is in Turkey where the secret army was the most violent and brutal. The Turkish branch of Gladio was created in the same year when Turkey joined NATO under the codename Counterguerilla, and it was located in the building of the Joint American Military Mission for Aid in the Turkish capital, Ankara.
Wait, what? Why would that be there? That's so strange.
The largest of the US-European commands. And who was one of its founding members? None other than the aforementioned Hitlerite Alparslan Türkeş. The Turkish National Security Service, MAH, received financial support from the CIA. Leading members of the Turkish Gladio were recruited from this agency. The CIA under Alan Dulles assigned former Nazi officers, Wehrmacht General Reinhard Gehlen, Butcher of Lyon and Che Guevara hunter Klaus Barbie, and various other fascists to train the Gladio leaders, including MAH officers in the camps from the Unconventional Warfare Department.
Wait, what?
In 1951, the Communist Party was...
Wait, what? No, wait. I thought we were fighting the World War II and the D-Day and we fought the Nazis. Wait, say it ain't so. You mean to tell me that we collaborated with some of the worst Nazis, like famous ones? Wasn't there a story that we read on the stream recently about how Mossad found Klaus Barbie and then were ordered to stand down? I'm trying to find that article now. Chad, this is what people mean when they say Germany lost the war but fascism won? Yes.
was crushed, and all of its leaders and most members were imprisoned through the notorious mass arrests ordered.
Why do you always say America bad, Hasan? So what if they funded and collaborated with Nazis globally to support fascist movements that slaughtered political dissidents? Yeah. Just weird that I would have such an opinion.
By the Menderes government, in full coherence, of course, with its proclamations of multi-party democracy. The Turkish Gladio was already active here, but it was not until a few years later in 1955 when it was involved in its first major operation. The Democrat Party orchestrated a secret action along with the counter-guerrilla to bomb the Turkish consulate in Thessaloniki in Greece, in the house where Atatürk was born. The so-called free press in Turkey would then spread the story suggesting that it was the Greeks who
Atamızın evi bomba ile hasara uğradı.
off the bomb. What followed would result in thousands of Greeks fleeing their homes, in what came to be known as the Istanbul pogrom, or
Today
the
your
Turkish
coverage is
Kristallnacht.
pretty bad, Hasan. What do you mean? Dude, I already ran the top of the hour ad break if you're doing that. Sen Selanik göçmeni miydin, öyle bir şeydi? I thought I was from Selanik. I thought my parents had told me that we're from Selanik, and then the Wikipedia page says we're from Drama, my father's side, which apparently is true. I was wrong my whole life. Not from Selanik, but from Crete and also Drama. Am I saying that right? I don't even know.
The state, along with the counter-guerrilla, carried out and supported mob attacks against Greeks, Armenian, or Jewish people, destroying their small businesses or abusing hundreds of Greek women, with the police being demonstrably present and doing nothing. And in the most ridiculous way possible, Menderes then blamed the communists, who had been themselves already crushed by the state, for carrying out those pogroms. And subsequently, 45 so-called card-carrying communists were arrested. This type of false flag action and propaganda was a core tool of the Gladio operations, not just in Turkey. The Menderes government grew increasingly unpopular. Money from the Marshall Plan ran out, and after the first severe economic crisis of Turkish capitalism in the 50s, it lost the support of both the parliament and the people. Under the pressure from the US, which saw Turkey as a breadbasket of the West, the DP had unilaterally promoted the agricultural sector with the funds of the Marshall Plan and renounced the development of heavy industry. Due to the massive foreign trade deficit amounting to 60% of total exports, urgently needed industrial goods such as machines and raw materials could no longer be imported. By borrowing from the World Bank and the IMF, Turkey continued to run up debt until it could no longer pay its foreign debts. Menderes reacted to the opposition by arresting his political rivals and critical journalists. Unfortunately, much of the indignation of the Turkish masses was channeled into organizations who
Whether they traded our parents and grandparents? Yeah, they traded our grandparents. It's
were
true.
themselves reactionary. As Kaipakaya wrote, since there was no communist leadership to show the way to the masses, the popular opposition followed this or that reactionary clique and was squandered. This is what always happens in situation of crises. Frustration and indignation get co-opted and channeled into movements that don't endanger the capitalist system, such as reformism and even fascism. Menderes was then deposed and was executed in the 1960 coup d'etat by the military officers, the first of several coups in the Republic of Turkey. The CIA-linked and US-trained Alparslan Türkeş was one of those commanders, and his clique wished to implement its fascist program. But the faction favoring a multi-party system around the coup leader, General Cemal Gürsel, who then became president, won out, and a new constitution was approved in 1961. The US wasn't too worried about this, as Gürsel quickly emphasized, Turkey remains faithful to its Western alliance. Now, former Prime Minister İsmet İnönü of the CHP was once again elected to restore freedom. Unsurprisingly, that didn't last very long.
Here's where the Grey Wolves come in.
Colonel Alparslan Türkeş attempted again to take power in 1963, but his coup attempt failed and he was put in jail. Comically, he was then released shortly afterward on the basis of a supposed lack of evidence. Now he was free to greatly affect Turkish politics in the coming years. In 1965, he founded the infamous National Action Party, short MHP, and more importantly, along.
It's just so strange how this guy. Yeah, Menderes was not a freedom fighter himself. He comes from feudal roots, feudal landlord, massive landlord, wealthy family. It's just so odd that this guy just keeps coming back and is building this ultra nationalist fascist party. What an impressive story. You know, real rags the riches type shit. You know what I mean? It's just so odd how that surely the US has no involvement. Surely. I mean, what? That's crazy.
Along with it, its youth organization and fascist paramilitary wing, the notorious Bozkurtlar, known in English as the Grey Wolves. Its ideology, the superiority of the Turkish race. Quote, what is the source of this superiority? The Turkish blood. Its goal, Turan, a united Turk state from Eastern Europe to Xinjiang.
This is part of the reason why I've always made a shit ton of jokes. I hope this is a little bit more illuminating for many of you in this chat who never really quite understood why I would like have so much smoke for someone like Vosh, before the goblin porn stuff. Because you were like, what? I don't understand. Like, he's just pro-NATO and you're anti-NATO. It was additionally laughable. And you will find out exactly why in a brief moment. It is additionally laughable that that community also happened to claim, while being pro-NATO themselves, mind you, that I was anti-Kurdish. And I was a pan-Turanist, Turk supremacist, anti-Kurdish, Turkish guy. It was just odd. It was odd and weird and funny because, like, you know, I do meme a lot about the Grey Wolves and shit like that. But it's pretty funny that they're saying that, like, my anti-NATO position makes me a fascist when NATO and Turkey, much like NATO in all of these other countries like Greece and Italy, is pro-fascist.
Quote, our struggle goes to the last man, to the last breath, to the last drop of blood.
Your points are really valid, but someone who watches you both for years, I don't think you disagree here. I think it's miscommunication from fans of clips. No, that motherfucker did literally say I'm anti-Kurd. Okay? He did. And he is also pro-NATO, so get the fuck out of here.
Our struggle continues until nationalist Turkey, until Turan is reached. The CIA and NATO-trained Türkeş initiated the movement with the purpose to establish a nationalist movement that could counter the communist efforts domestically and.
This is pretty important. The Turanist movement is very important as an anti-communist measure, both inside of Turkey and also, as Bestie Marks correctly pointed out in the beginning of the fucking video, everywhere where the USSR existed. Because there is a lot of Turkic nations under the banner of the USSR at this point, and they are trying to, America, by way of Turkey, is trying to instill separatist movements and nationalist movements by training, supporting militia movements. They still literally exist inside of Russian boundaries to this day, as a matter of fact. And there is still some level of involvement from the Turkish government with even Xinjiang all the way to, because it spans all the way to what would be considered East Turkestan, Xinjiang, under the Chinese nation state. Yeah. So all the way to Uyghurs, like these are all Turkic people. Remember, half of my family's last name is literally Uyghur. Okay? Like that's Cenk's last name. That's my mother's literal fucking last name before she married my father. So this is what is that sign? Hardly a serious fascist gesture, Lamau. I mean, it means different. The symbolism is important for Turkey. Obviously, it's laughable everywhere else. I even throw it up regularly.
Internationally, and the Grey Wolves would soon wreak havoc on left-wing activists. Naturally, whenever fascist paramilitaries are created, the eyes of the Yankee CIA defenders of democracy and freedom shine with excitement.
Then Jim Angleton appeared in August. He began recruiting fascists because he figured that the best way to control the communists was to hire fascists.
CIA officer Ray Klein said in an interview on Operation Gladio in Italy, quote, "It was not far-fetched that some far-right groups were recruited because, after all, they would be the only ones to warn us if there was a risk of a war against the communists in Italy." Former CIA agent Philip Agee, who wrote books revealing sensitive information, stated that, quote, "Paramilitary groups, directed by CIA officers, operated in the 60s throughout Europe, and perhaps no activity of the CIA could be as clearly linked to the possibility of internal subversion." Mehtap Söyler explains in her book how Western powers used Operation Gladio to promote Turanism in Turkey through Alparslan Türkeş as a founding member of the counter-guerrilla. In 1965, a new intelligence agency was formed with the help of the CIA, the National Intelligence Organization, or short MIT, not to be confused with this MIT. The MIT soon penetrated, quote,
To add some nuance, there was a serfdom in Turkey. The progressive left-leaning people were co-opted by the ultra-nationalist-led coup because the coup was against the feudal lords and Islamist Menderes. That makes the story in Turkey much more complex, yes.
The entire fabric...
And Turks still hold, Turks, as a consequence of ultra-nationalist sentiment, still hold a massive, massive amount of, pre-AKP, the way that the army was seen is like the protectorate of Turkish democracy. And still to this day, many Turks see it as such. And will criticize Erdogan for genuinely eviscerating the influence of the Turkish military in general. However, obviously the Turkish military does, military shit all the time. But it does add a layer of complexity to the conversation for sure.
Of the Turkish society. Many MIT members and Grey Wolves, which one could barely distinguish at that point, would join the Gladio counter-guerrilla.
MIT is the Turkish CIA.
Counter-guerrilla were institutionally united and from 1967 operated out of the secret CIA-sponsored Special Warfare Department in Ankara. The central goal of the department being, quote, "In the case of a communist occupation or of a rebellion, to use guerrilla methods and all possible underground activities to bring an end to the occupation." The CIA was so successful in creating a massive web of Turkish secret services, even MIT officers would acknowledge they were dependent on Washington. In 2008, a court document during the so-called Ergenekon trials revealed that the MIT had funded and armed members of the Grey Wolves in order to carry out political assassinations, such as against Kurdish or Armenian liberation fighters. Toward the end of the 60s, MIT members would also cooperate with the Israeli Mossad to murder Palestinians. In Turkey, another economic recession worsened the situation dramatically. At the end of the decade, social unrest intensified, labor strikes, student riots, political assassinations, and so on. Turkey had adopted 5-year plans in the 60s, not the socialist ones, but state-directed capitalist ones, to develop industry through import substitution. This led to rapid growth of the working class, going from 2.2 million wage earners to almost 4 million by 1970, including 600,000 women who previously worked in agriculture or at home. Due to the more liberal constitution of 1961, worker organizing was made easier, hence trade union membership tripled to 1 million throughout the 60s. The increased labor organizing caused headaches among industry leaders.
Yeah, even though the origination, or not the origination, but like the labor unions were supposed to be co-opted, obviously, in times of economic volatility, instability, labor unions still were like, okay, well, we're going to do what we're supposed to do, and became more revolutionary as a consequence of the economic uncertainty. And therefore, this created yet another problem for the labor unions, or for another problem in the eyes of the Turkish government against the labor unions.
In February of 1969, during the so-called Bloody Sunday, tens of thousands of left-wing students and workers marched on Taksim Square in Istanbul to protest against the arrival of the US 6th Fleet. Among the key leaders of that protest was a certain Deniz Gezmiş. More on him later.
Chad.
The Association for the Fight Against Communism had called for a counter-demonstration. During the rally, right-wing extremist groups, with the protection of law enforcement and with some of them controlled by the Turkish counter-guerrilla, attacked the protesting people with knives, chains, and sticks. 2 protesters were killed.
This is Bloody Sunday. That's crazy. Why would the police... What? How could this have happened?
And over 100 were injured, all under the eyes of the police, who merely attacked the left, but not their buddies from the right. The working class did not forget those who fell on Bloody Sunday. A year later, the state-affiliated Turkish Trade Union Confederation had requested an amendment to the trade union law which would have effectively led to the closure of the more left-wing Disk Union. After the amendment went into effect, unions called for protests on June 13. 20,000 people were expected, but when 150,000 workers took to the streets of Istanbul, even the trade union leadership was shocked. The most brutal police repression, all the tanks and gunshots, couldn't stop the protesters. Only a state of emergency, which...
Turkey is still significantly more radical in comparison to America, by the way. Like, May Day, in my lifetime, even when I was growing up, May Day was like... May Day still to this day, I think. Maybe not to this day, but like, when I was growing up, May Day was a massive, massive fucking site of protests. Still. May 1st. Internationally, that is the real Labor Day, which is ironic considering that it comes from the United States of America, and yet we don't have it here. We have a different Labor Day in the United States of America than May Day.
Was declared 3 days later, could bring this historic protest.
They suppressed May Day in Istanbul heavily this year. They didn't let people travel to Taksim. Yeah, nowadays you can't. Nowadays, they don't even let you do it, I guess.
To an end. It was this massive worker struggle in June of 1970, which is now
Class consciousness yok ama nedense TR'de işçiler May Day'i çok seviyor, haklarını biliyorlar.
Considered among the largest of organized labor in Turkey's history, which Kaypakaya considered to be, quote, proof that the objective conditions of the revolution have become mature in Turkey. The ruling classes concurred and interpreted the two-day workers' uprising as the beginning of a systemic crisis of Turkish capitalism. Something big needed to be done quickly to save the system from the wrath of the people. The social unrest would lead into another major coup in 1971.
Yeah, May Day is a celebration for what happened in Chicago. How dumb is that the USA doesn't celebrate it? Is it dumb? Or is it deliberate?
Ushering in one of the bloodiest decades of recent Turkish history, where thousands would die at the hands of CIA-assisted right-wing terror. At the beginning of 1971, Turkish society was in mayhem. Turkey's second coup was only a matter of time. Labor strikes exploded everywhere, universities stopped working, and young left-wing activists robbed banks, attacked US targets, and created urban guerrillas. The dominant party at the time was the Justice Party, a descendant of the Democrat Party of Menderes. The Justice Party's Süleyman Demirel, who had been elected in 1965 as Turkey's youngest prime minister, was overwhelmed with the chaos, and the military apparatus didn't like that. Chief of the General Staff, Memduh Tamaç, demanded a strong government which will, quote, neutralize the current anarchical situation. After Demirel's refusal to grant the military more political influence in the anti-uprising struggles, the generals had enough. The tanks were deployed, and Tamaç handed the prime minister a memorandum in March, meaning, either you resign or we'll depose you. Demirel, not having a real choice here, resigned, and the military leaders took over, exhibiting that
Leftist robbing banks just makes you a Stalinist. They were fucking Maoists. They were Stalinists. They were these guys were real Marxist-Leninists, 100%.
in the modern state, the gun has the last word. But the chaos didn't stop. By the end of April, martial law was declared once more. Strikes and union meetings were prohibited. Thousands of people, communists, trade unionists, left-leaning academics, and journalists, faced harsh sentences and suffered systematic torture. Left publications were banned and confiscated. The fascist ones were left untouched, of course.
That's
After
weird.
the People's Liberation Army of Turkey, short PHKO, abducted an Israeli consul in May, the government escalated their ruthless repression. The 1961 constitution was regarded as too permissive of left ideologies and was amended.
That's so strange because you hear Erdogan and all these other like Turkish people. Turkish people as a population are obviously anti-Israel by incredibly wide margins. Turkish government, on the other hand, has oftentimes collaborated with the Israeli government and Israeli authorities and Israeli espionage agencies.
Meanwhile, the infamous Ziverbey Villa in Istanbul served as a torture center, where the CIA trained specialists and the Grey Wolves in the MIT and the counterguerrilla interrogated countless people, employing physical and psychological torture. It's here where the term counterguerrilla was mentioned for the first time to anyone who wasn't a member. A well-known journalist who was tortured there later wrote that they told him, quote, "We are the counterguerrilla. Even the President of the Republic cannot touch us." As repression and the contradictions within Turkish society intensified, and due to events in France, Vietnam, or China, a new wave of organizations emerged, and its leaders had one immediate goal: revolution. The communist movement was seriously weakened. The revisionist parties who had ossified in the hopes of changing Turkey through democratic reforms were crushed themselves. It was the military crackdown, and importantly, the great
This is why I always say, like, no matter what happens in all of these countries, they don't just, they're never only focused on like the MLs or, you know, vanguard revolutionary parties. It is always a cross section, both in Italy and in Western Europe in general, wherever NATO operated. They literally gutted every aspect of left-leaning organization. This is precisely the reason why the Cold War was so unimaginably successful for capitalists, and the reason why so many people in Europe literally are, and in America especially, are just terrified of the word socialism and think that it's like, it means, you know, awful, it means something bad. It's just it's basically like a pejorative. It doesn't stop. It, depending on where you are looking at, depending on what country you are looking at, it doesn't just stop at trade unionists either. Sometimes it means like if you're a part of any kind of women's rights group, for example. Counter-guerrilla has threatened the CHP leader Ecevit, a prime minister of Turkey. Yeah. 7 assassination attempts, including one on U.S. soil, mind you, when he said he would go after the counter-guerrilla and hold them accountable. There was an assassination attempt on his life. Not one, 7 total assassination attempts on his life, including one on American soil. Here, I wanted to show you this. Wait, hold on. Where the fuck did he go? Here. Bülent Ecevit was subject, or not 7, sorry. 6 assassination attempts. All but one occurred in the 1970s. 5 happened in Turkey and 1 on U.S. soil. The most famous of which took place on the 23rd of July, 1976 in New York City by a Greek Cypriot, and on the 29th of May, 1977 at Çiğli Airport. Mehmet İsvan, brother of the mayor of Istanbul, Ahmet İsvan, was injured in the attempt at Çiğli Airport. Various testimonies allege that the weapon used in the Çiğli Airport originated from the Special Warfare Department, Special Forces unit of the Turkish Army. Founded in 1952, formed out of the Army's Tactical Mobilization Group, Seferberlik Taktik Kurulu, and it was disbanded in 1992 with responsibility for special operations then taken over by the new Special Forces Command. They were also funded and trained by the USA. During the Cold War, the SVD,